Welcome to this evening's presentation of two bald guys from New Jersey. This is actually true. Junot and I just met, and you're from Perth Amboy, right?
Oh, from outside of Perth Amboy.
Right. So
Yeah.
you're Perth Amboy adjacent.
Yeah, that kind of spillover bedroom community.
And I'm from a town called Berkeley Heights, and I was amazed that you'd heard of it.
Yeah, I delivered 3 pool tables there. You were amazed I could remember that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I was, because what I said to Junot backstage, I was like, oh yeah, Berkeley Heights. And nobody's ever heard of Berkeley Heights. It's this tiny little suburb. It's like the Brigadoon of New Jersey, and nobody's ever heard of it.
Right, minus the magic.
Yeah. And he said to me, oh yeah, I delivered 3 pool tables. 3, I mean, you remember, how many years ago was this?
That was between 1985 and 1993.
So you were delivering pool tables over a period of 7 years, 8 years. And you could remember at this distance that 3 of those pool tables went to Berkeley Heights, New Jersey.
It's easy. I mean, I was just saying, it's like there's no other place in New Jersey with such a absolutely aspirational name like Berkeley Heights. You know? It's like sort of a, it's kind of a, I don't know, it's like I'm an immigrant kid, so I totally connect to geographical wishful thinking. So I'm like, I'm all about it, you know? I'm all about it.
There's Sparta, New Jersey. That's pretty aspirational.
So, Troy too.
Troy,
no, but nothing beats those. Whenever that whole rash of, and you see it all over from the east all the way to the Midwest, that whole like rash of naming cities after kind of these classical icons. But Berkeley Heights, I just like loved that. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway. But I like to imagine, we weren't there at quite the same time. I was already moved out, but I love the idea. And we never had a pool table, but I love the idea like a truck pulls up, and in walks these Dominican guys with
No, it was me and an African-American dude.
Okay. And I want to and deliver to this, suburban house where there's this Jewish kid who's going to Harvard, and it's like, freeze it, which of these is going to win a MacArthur Genius Grant?
That's America. Yeah.
One imagines. So I had all these questions that I was going to ask you, having read and enjoyed Brief Wondrous Life in the latest book. Then something happened today that sort of leads into a question, which was that we just got the news that Oscar Hijuelos died today. Yeah, author of Mambo King's Play Songs of Love and many other great books. Did you know him?
I had met Oscar Hijuelos once, him and his wife. But of course, I knew all his work. His work was profoundly influential on me. So it was terrible news, and he was so young. Yeah,
he was in his early 60s.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, and why it leads into what I wanted to talk to you about, or at least start with, is that I think anyway, of American authors, and there's a certain line of them, and you could put Herman Roth in that, who wrote Call It Sleep. You could put Isaac Bashevis Singer in it, who wrote about the Jewish experience in Yiddish, and Philip Roth. And then you could put Hijuelos in it for writing about Cubans in America later on. You could put in, I'm blanking on his name, but he wrote Jeffrey Eugenides writing about the Greek community in Detroit. And there's like these writers who are coming out of immigrant diasporas or immigrant communities and saying, this is who we are. And they're almost like explaining this community to the rest of America. So the question is, are you the voice of like the Dominican immigrant experience?
One would hope not. I'm not just saying that. I guess I wanted to do just quick housekeeping stuff. First, thank you for taking the time for the interview. I wanted to thank the Chicago Humanities Festival for having me. I mean, guys, it doesn't always happen. Anyone invites you anywhere, so it's like nice. And I also wanted to thank everyone who made this event possible. Bunch of people working super, super hard for it to come off as well as it did. And for all you who came out, I mean, there's always better things to do. I appreciate it. It's true. I mean, some of you, probably even have like babysitters to come out here, and I appreciate it.
It's Chicago. They're not going to be watching baseball.
No. You never know. You'd be amazed, right? But the question, of course, I feel like for me the question is sort of a couple things. There's a couple questions for me, at least that I'm sort of responding to when I hear that. First of all is how how utterly marginal what we would call immigrant writing is to America's literary conception of itself. So while it might make some gestures towards the idea, I mean, Americans have that wonderful myth that we'd love to trot out every now and then, which is like we're an immigrant country, which of course we clearly are. But that's just sort of a myth we evoke to absolutely keep it off the table. Yeah? It's like you just bring it up a little bit and you never have to talk about it again. Yeah? It's anyone who's part of an organized religious system knows that that's a big part of human nature, is that you raise something just so that you could silence it forever. And I find this to be the case. You know, I'm one of these people, I'm a big old book nerd. Anytime that there's a list of top 100 books, I always get on there to see what books I gotta read and buy in order, you know. And what's extraordinary is how many books from sort of the American shibboleths, they will list 50, 80, 90, 100 books. And you'll read this list and there won't be a single book that involves the immigrant experience. And I think that this is a very big part of that. I think that when I think of this question, I think of how as a country we have these kind of bizarrely distorted senses of what our important narratives are.
Right.
Now, as far as I'm concerned, I think that, again, I'm always sort of cautious because if you just use any sort of metric, one book cannot represent 10 million people. I think a book can open up conversations with a whole wide range of folks, including perhaps the community that the book is set in. But I'm always cautious because I know that it's, you know, what really communities need, irregardless of what their composition is, communities need a diversity of books. Yeah, and I think that just having like 4 or 5 books about a Dominican diasporic experience, or we can name 6 or 7 books about immigrants, is not precisely what y'all need. I think what we need is a much greater amount. What we need is a greater sense of how these narratives aren't just, you know, sort of interesting outshoots, but that we've got to get to the heart of what it means to be in this project we call America, and how immigration is such a huge part of it. So I myself, I don't think I'm the voice of the Dominican Republic, the Dominican diasporic experience. I think no one can be. I certainly like to be in the conversation. That's not a bad idea. You know, I feel being in the conversation's good.
But it seems to be a major concern of your work. I mean, you know, there's such an almost an obsession with like what it is to be Dominican. Like, you know, I wanted to talk to you about like the whole aspect of like sexuality, which is the obsession of the latest book, This Is How You Lose Her. And it's like, oh man, he's a Dominican, which means you're going to behave in a certain way, or he's not really a Dominican. And the whole Oscar wow, you know, poor Oscar is like, you're not a Dominican because you're into all these books. So like, what is a Dominican, what is not a Dominican, how that translates into America seems to be like a pretty big deal to you.
Well, but I mean, I think we should be cautious about how characters talk amongst themselves versus what the author's concerns are. I mean, I think that, look, I hang around in Chicago. I've been here maybe 36 hours. How many people have I overheard talking about Chicago? Chicagoans love to talk about fucking Chicago. You know? Y'all fucking love talking about Chicago. Now, does that mean that that's your central interest? That that's what's really going on in your life? No. And I guess I'm sort of pointing out.
Yeah.
I'm pointing out that a lot of the conversations that my characters are having about Dominicanness is simply a shorthand for them to talk about things which I think most of the time we need shorthands for. In this case, it's to talk about masculinity.
Right.
It's to talk about in or out group belonging. So it's not to say that I'm not interested in talking about what is a Dominican and what's not, but I'm also just want to make sure to preserve that when characters are sitting around saying, you're not black enough, we're talking about more than just blackness. That there's a lot that's coded in that has to do with senses of authenticity and how much we're attracted to authenticity. And I think that the vocabulary of inside and outside is a vocabulary that we're all accustomed to, and that it's a vernacular that we're all really, really fluent in. And so when my characters are saying, oh, you're a dog because you're Dominican, I mean, what group doesn't that apply to?
Right.
Who's sitting around and saying, like, name a group you're dating? Oh, just white dudes? Who's sitting around and saying, oh, white dudes are awesome? They're just so faithful. Infidelity is just not a problem. It's, again, I think a lot of these things become ways communities concretize conversations about themselves. And
right.
what I, just to make sure to add this, part of the reason that we in the Dominican Republic and the Dominican diasporic community have this narrative in circulation about Dominican male misbehavior has to do with Dominican diasporic feminism. That a lot of women have fought and struggled against this kind of masculinity, this kind of patriarchy.
Right.
And they have planted this idea that this group of dudes is problematic. And I think we'd all be better off if every group of women had it in circulation, like, watch out for these dudes, you know? Because there ain't no group of dudes who's like, oh, I'm amazing, you know? And I guess that's what I'm interested in. I'm very much interested in how we use local phenomena, or as an artist, how I'll use local phenomena to access larger things. I always use the same example. Melville ain't just talking about whalers, right?
Right.
You can't read Moby Dick and say, wow, he really didn't like whalers, or whalers are like this. It's just a metaphor, you know? And for me, it's useful because I am interested in the Dominican community. I am committed to the Dominican community. I am interested in my diaspora. I am, in many ways, it profoundly engages me. But I also know that my work wouldn't have power if I didn't realize that this stuff, even for our own community, is a shorthand.
Right.
And it allows other people to engage it too, which is, thank God for metaphor, you know?
Yeah. I feel like I want to push you on this only because my personal...
Push your head. I'm good at that.
Yeah, I can tell. And then we'll talk about Tolkien. Because this is my reaction to the book. Basically, this is what I knew about Dominicans before I read your book. Some of them are really good at baseball. And that when I was many, many years ago in the mid-'90s looking at an apartment in Washington Heights, somebody I knew who lived up there said, and this was the nicest guy in the world, you know, who, as they say, not a racist bone in his body. And he said to me, one thing you got to be careful of, a lot of Dominicans live up here. They're pretty loud. Their food, I don't know, it smells not good, right? That's it. That was the extent of my knowledge of the Dominican experience. And then I read Short Wondrous Life, and I'm like, holy shit. Not that there's this, it's not like, oh wow, there are people too. But I didn't know anything about the Dominican Republic. I didn't know anything about its history. I didn't know anything about Trujillo. I didn't know anything about its customs. I didn't know anything about its culture. I didn't know anything about its ideas of, I didn't know anything. In reading your book, it's like, oh, there's everything. There's this rich life. There's this astonishing thing going on behind the facade that I was too self-involved to look behind. So, whether or not you want to have done that, to represent to the reading public however many years ago when WoW came out, you did, I think, say, this is this community. These are the people who live in your cities. These are the people who you see. And I can speak for this experience.
I mean, I think there's a couple things there. First, I mean, God, it's always strange how, like, white supremacy loves to think about people, yeah? So it's like, that's like kind of like, no, it's like, I mean, honestly, for real. It's just fascinating because I've always interested in the way white supremacy narrativizes the world. Because think about if white people shut the fuck up for one day. No, I mean, I'm always thinking about who the fuck is louder than white folks, yo. Jesus, it's all we talk about. So there's always that kind of, No, for real. It's like, turn on the news, it's like, why? Why?
Dude, I work for NPR, I know.
Yeah. So that's fascinating. That reaction of your friend is fascinating because, it's like the default. They should just print a little card, But I guess my second thing is just that, again, I mean, I'm not saying that a book as an effect can't create communities. In other words, one of the things that we learned for those of us who are like, I'm sure there's college students out there who get to read Benedict Anderson and understand the way that the novel does certain kinds of ideological work, that novels create readerships, and they help to create sort of what we would call affiliations. A book can have an effect where people feel like, wow, this book is speaking to our national moment. The thing with it is you got to remember that I'm on the creative side. I'm on the making it side, which means that for me, what made this book spectacularly interesting was its utter particularity.
Right.
And I guess that's why this conversation is happening, is because my interest in the particular guarantees to a certain degree that across the board, people will feel like this is speaking to a community or a universal experience.
Right.
And so that's the reason we're sort of like dancing around this, because it is the very fact that I write about one dot in a community that people can insist that this is about a larger thing.
Right.
And it's one of the strangest things about the particular, is that the particular, something about the way our minds work, the particular allows us to imagine in a more ample way collectives. And I think that there's so many Dominicans and so many people from New Jersey, the two communities that I tend to write in, who will say, this has got nothing to do with us.
Right.
I get plenty of mail where people are like, this is not the Dominican experience at all. And so in my mind, I'm kind of wrestling with all that stuff. I think that as an artist, at least what sort of draws me to the question is how, and this leads to this conversation, is how one thing can be absolutely yes and no at the same time. And that's what I think as an artist fascinates me. It's not that I'm rejecting entirely this concept, is that I'm also wanting to make sure that whatever's happening in this conversation, the other thing exists equally.
Yeah, no, I mean, nobody sits around to write the great novel of the Dominican immigrant experience, or nobody sits around to write the great novel of anything. You write the stories you're going to write about the people you want to write about. And whatever happens as an effect of that is, in a weird way, out of your control.
But also just, I kind of, if you think about it, I'll never forget my best friend, one of the people I write for, this guy I absolutely adore. When I think of my audience, all the time when we go to bookstores in Santo Domingo and somebody recommends a book, you know what the first question he says is?
What?
Is it about Trujillo? And if they say yes, he doesn't want to read it. There was already a sense among most of the young people and the interesting folks that I was coming into contact with that the topic of this dictatorship that had been oversaturated.
Right.
And then again, when I told my friends that I grew up with, when I was telling them, hey, listen, I'm working on Dominican Nerds, they were just like, what does this have to do with our community at all?
Right.
So I guess I remember the entire 11 years when I was working on this novel, people were like, oh, he's writing the non-Dominican book.
Because it's about a nerd.
It's about a nerd, and it's about three young people wwho go to college.
Right.
I mean, damn. Your buddy would be like, have a heart attack,
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that, because this is the other thing I really wanted to talk to you about, which is the nerddom that is suffused, especially in Oscar Wilde, and a little bit pops up around the corners of the latest book. Were you, Junot Díaz, a nerd?
Oh, yeah, man. Shit. I think if they could have given out State Department passports, well, my ass would have been like my face and a map of Middle Earth. They would have been like, well done.
Yeah.
But it was
Elfiers.
Yeah.
Do you know where you would have come from in Middle Earth? Because it's pretty
Yeah.
big.
Oh, it's easy for me because I always connected to, again, this shows you the kind of Caribbean history. I always connected to people who were from shattered post-genocidal societies. So I always liked the Rangers of the North because, you know, the kingdom of Arnor gets absolutely destroyed.
Right.
And it's people sent into diaspora because the Witch King of Angmar shatters them. So, I mean, I'm like that, you know? That sounds
Wait a
like...
minute. Excuse me. No. Those are the Jews.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Yeah. And every other person who survives a genocide and their people are scattered. You know, that's why these metaphors are really important.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess my thing was, my nerdiness was always had to be understood in that specific context of my kind of life coming up. I came from a military family.
Yeah.
You know, my old man, Dominican military, yeah, total pro-dictator,
Right.
crypto-fascist. My oldest sister spent her 80s, the years of the 80s on a tank base in Germany. My little brother is a Marine combat veteran. My brother was in ROTC till his cancer pulled him out. You know, my two nephews, my only kind of nephews really of that age, both of them are like triple Iraq, Afghanistan tour veterans. And I came up with a family that was super obsessed with this. You know, like, it's hard to describe what life was like in the Diaz household because every Sunday my father would take us to the Englishtown rifle range and the whole family would shoot. That would be like, yay, we had a family gathering, you know? And a lot of guys would have loved that. I absolutely despised it. My dad's like concept of a midlife crisis was to pick up a black belt in judo. So the whole family knew at least one or two martial arts. I grew up boxing. You know, most guys would be like, wow, your dad takes you shooting and you know how to box. That's awesome. I despised it. I never liked it. And so I was kind of a nerd in a family where we had a ton of what we would call this sort of symbolic capital, which is to say that, like, we were the family of a bunch of really tough, crazy people who had like 20-something firearms in the house.
Yeah.
And that allowed me to be a nerd in my neighborhood in the ways no one else could be. I mean, but it's true.
You weren't going to tease me? Like, I'm not
No,
going to
but
mess with this guy.
But it's actually incredibly true, you guys. To grow up where I did, because I had an older sister who was like, my oldest sister did time. My oldest sister would beat half the dudes up in a town. Older brother who was like just a borderline sociopath. It meant that I had space to have an identity that normally would have been completely occulted.
Right.
You know? And I always think that my older siblings, because they were the front line, allowed me to have interests that I may have been chased out of, that may have been otherwise beaten out of me. Because I was permitted to be really nerdy and to be equally part of that world of my father's, that kind of muscular, hyper-masculine tradition. Typical kid, you want to please your father, you want their love. I mean, I would have done anything for my father's love, so, you know, I did these things I didn't like to do. And so I kind of had this, for me, when I think about my bicultural life, when I think about my own identity, I think of this kid who can talk to you about any science fiction, comic book, fantasy, horror, but this other kid who grew up, you know, with this hyper-masculine world that I was trying to excel in so that my dad would be like, you're a good son.
Well, you just kind of described Junior and Oscar.
Yeah, or just Junior.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, and again, I'm kind of fascinated by how much you and I are alike and how much we're different, but when I was reading Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and all those guys, was basically something that was more interesting than what seemed to me the very mundane, boring world. My father was a corporate guy, worked his whole life for one company. It was very boring. You know, the houses literally looked the same wherever you went because they were built by the same developer. So for me, you know, going to Middle Earth was like so cool because it was exciting and adventurous and an escape for me. And also I didn't feel like I fit in well in the world that I lived in. Wasn't good at sports, the usual thing. What were you doing? What did that nerdery, what did the comic books and the science fiction and the fantasy provide for you in that extremely different environment?
Yeah. I mean, I always had a sense that there was another world.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing about growing up in the Dominican Republic for the first 6 years, and then coming to the U.S. meant that I had a profound, like, sense that there was another world. And that I also spent my first 6 years, my father was in the States, dreaming of the world that I would go to, dreaming of the United States. And I had this my imaginative muscles, the sort of like what made up the mechanism of my sense of the future was dreaming about this other world that I never knew anything about. When I got to New Jersey and I saw that, like, oh shit, poverty sucks everywhere, the United States wasn't going to be the dream I thought, I think I kept looking for other worlds. I was convinced that we had gotten off at the wrong stop, you know? No, for real, because when you spend your first 6 years, everybody telling you, oh, America's amazing, it sounds like heaven. You get to where I was living, I was like, damn. I think a part of me had always dreamed that there was this more interesting, fun, other place. And those muscles, instead of letting them atrophy, I think that I just kept searching for them.
Right.
I think the other thing for me was that, like you, what teenager, even the ones who are the most popular, feels like they belong, you know? I think it's one of the common experiences. We feel like freaks as adolescents, and some of us socially get sifted out as well. We don't just feel like freaks, we're structurally made to be the freaks. And then I think for me, there was a bunch of stuff happening that there was no place for me to talk about it. I was coming up in New Jersey in a poor Black and Latino community in the 80s when all the crack madness was unfolding, when everybody was getting locked up for all the kind of, you know, those Rockefeller-like lockup laws, when AIDS was just going through our communities and just doing crazy damage. And I'm like delivering my newspaper in the 80s. And also, again, a Latino community, we were getting a ton of folks coming in from the Central American wars, people who had been like tortured, their families burnt out. We're turning on the Spanish language news, and I'm seeing stuff on the news that my American peers aren't seeing, because the Spanish language news was covering the Central American wars like closely. And there was a part of me that needed a place to think about not only where I came from and what it meant to be a person of African descent, an immigrant in a country that seems to pretend that we don't exist, but also that was seeing this incredibly complicated world. I think that these imaginary worlds allowed me to think about what was happening in my present. For me, they were certainly an escape, no question. But they were also a way for me to kind of understand my present in a profound way that I wasn't finding in realism, that I wasn't finding in the kind of square kind of stories.
Right.
Yeah, like the craziness of those books felt like it paralleled a lot of the craziness that I was seeing.
Can you tell me some of your favorites?
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, I was thinking recently about, thinking kind of just obsessively about when I was a kid, there used to be this comic book. It's come out again, but for a while it was only kind of a late 80s comic book called Mr. X. And Mr. X made, like, again, Dean Motter, made a lot of sense to me because it was about, basically it was sort of a retelling of the story of Brasilia, this city that gets engineered, that just gets made. But in this comic book, Brasilia gets made, and it's made with this idea that we can create a perfect city whose architecture, the very way that the city's laid out, will increase people's happiness.
Right.
People will just feel better being in the city. But of course, the contractors and the city fathers take shortcuts. And when the city is made, the city is deformed. And it has the exact opposite effect. It's slowly driving all its residents insane. And the main character is, of course, modeled after Oscar Niemeyer. The main character, Mr. X, is the guy who drew up the plans and ends up being imprisoned and thrown away because they wanted to change the plans. And he was like, if you do this, it'll drive people crazy. And so this comic book was about literally this guy who is sort of the Batman for, you know, this city slowly going mad, where he tries to fix the worst effects of the city. And this was literally a popular comic. You know, people were being able to buy it off the shelf. And I was a kid who was delivering a newspaper, so I already knew about Brasilia and knew who Oscar Niemeyer was. And so when I read that, I was like, oh, this is what they're talking about.
Right.
And the thought that you could build a cityscape that you could build an urban environment that would drive its residents mad. Anybody who grew up poor anywhere knows that that makes perfect sense.
Right.
You know?
Do you ever go back, because I've been doing this lately as I go through my own midlife crisis, and reread some of this stuff?
Oh yeah, I do it all the time, man. I'm like torturing myself that way.
And is it, because I just bought the Frank Miller, Chris Claremont Wolverine miniseries.
Sure.
They made, which was the recent movie was based on, which is why I bought it. And I loved that stuff when it came out. I was like, you know, ninjas.
The 80s, man.
Ah.
The 80s. We were like, how do we deal with Japan's rising economic power? Ninjas.
Ninjas!
Yeah.
I'm the best at what I do, and what I do isn't very nice.
Yeah.
And it's kind of bad. And I don't know if it's bad or if so much has happened since then in comic books that it's so far left in the dust that to go back you have to forget almost 30 years of like really good writing that's built on that. Or is it that, you know, let me ask you this. Do you ever look back on how you spent your youth reading and the culture you were taking in and wishing that, in my case, instead of trying to learn Elvish so I could teach my dog Elvish, I might have learned, say, to talk to girls, or at the very least, French.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, this is a weird one for me because this is a weird one. Again, for the first part, the thing about the 80s is that there is a bunch of stuff that you look back at it now and you're just like, no. But look, everything that we enjoy and love now was beta tested in the 80s. And so whether we're talking about video games, whether we're talking about the internet, whether we're talking about social media, whether we're talking about even some of the basic storylines, a lot of that stuff was being beta tested in the 80s. And there is a bunch of things that still hold up. Sure, that Wolverine miniseries, unreadable. On the other hand, you can certainly read Frank Miller's Elektra Assassin that was published a year or two later. I'm teaching for my students. Now, the second part of the question, again, I sort of had, you got to know that we have so many cultures in the United States. And when I was coming up, my family was an immigrant family, and what they wanted from me were very practical immigrant things.
Right.
My mom was like, if this reading is not leading to $1 million job, why are you doing it? My mom was like stunned when she discovered that reading and academic success, that there was no connection. Like, it really like almost shattered her campesina imaginary because she was like, this is the dude I don't got to worry about. He's reading.
Right.
So when I got like graduated, when I basically failed out of high school and they were just like, get the hell out because we don't want you here. My mom was, to say that she was stunned would just be the greatest understatement of all. And my thing was that like, because I had my mom sort of wanting me in one side to spend my time to be incredibly practical, because again, if you come from a poor kind of family where family loyalty is really important, there's this sense that your parents give up their whole lives for you. Certainly my mother threw herself on the grenade of America every day to make sure that we ate. And there was a part of us that felt like, damn, the least I owe my mom is to be an engineer, you know?
Right.
And so I think there's that wrestling with that side. But certainly, again, socially, I came up in a very, I came up in an African-American, Latino neighborhood. And the social aspect of it, I sort of felt like I probably would have went mad in a suburb because we had so much more contact with each other.
Yeah.
Like when I hear about my friends, I was like, they tell me they had their own rooms. I wish we had our own rooms, but they also sound like those were really lonely adolescents.
Yeah.
Where my house, let me tell you, my little tiny apartment, basically 3 rooms, my sister and all her friends were there. So there was like, every day there'd be like a pack of girls hanging out. And then me and all my friends would be there because my mom was the nice mom. She would feed everybody. And if you got thrown out of your house, my mom had like 12 mattresses in the basement. She was like a mini Red Cross for that neighborhood. And our house was like, it was a peaceful place because my mom was super hard and super tough, but she was, again, she liked us. And that's not a bad thing to have when you're a kid in those worlds. And I felt like I had a lot of strong socialization. This is a long way of saying that, like, we always had girls around.
So you didn't need to worry about
It
that.
was a fancy way. No,
that's the segue,
I think
'cause I
all
only
guys
got-
worry. But we had a lot of girls around, you know.
I only have a few minutes before you guys get to ask some questions. So that's a good segue, which is at the end of, and this is how you lose her, you have Junior. You're Juno. He's Junior.
Oh, I'm Junot.
I'm completely confused now. You have Junior sitting there. He's living a life in the last story, which is not unlike yours, living in Boston and teaching. And he sits there with a pile, if I remember correctly, the collected emails of his sucias, his girlfriends.
All the girls. Yeah.
And he sits down in the last in the last story as he decides to sort of start writing that book. Which leads to the question, how'd you do with girls?
I mean, it's always what is that called? That's a conflict of interest to ask a straight guy how he does with girls, right? You got to ask all my exes, you know? They definitely would be more informative, you know? I know that I'll tell you what, you know, there's some people in the world who, if they catch you cheating, will print all the emails out, put them in a binder, and then beat you with it.
Yeah.
I've always liked dating those girls, yo. I don't know what it is, man. Women who are organized. But I mean, I don't know. I guess I always felt like I was pretty, I mean, my friends always say, like, oh, this dude, he's like a retired slut. So, I don't know. I always feel like they're impugning me somehow. But it was a different, I don't know. I guess I did fine and not fine. I mean, I think that, again, if you grow up the way I did, and I'm talking about New Jersey, yeah? No, for real. If you grew up in the world that I grew up in New Jersey, and you pursued your masculine privilege as gleefully as I did, no, which is, I mean, that's kind of malign, to be honest.
Could you define masculine privilege?
Sure, easily. I could come home at 1 a.m. in the morning, any day in high school, with a harpoon covered in blood, and my mom would have been like, "What's up? What do you want for dinner?" My sister would get a phone call, and if it was a male voice, my mom would hang up. And I feel like masculine privilege is perfectly described there. You know, is that, you know, there's a lot that goes into it, man. And I just felt like, I guess my thing was...
Did you ever actually come home with a harpoon covered with blood, or is that another Melville reference?
No, but it concretizes the kind of craziness that we would be up to.
Right.
My brother would literally walk in the house with 2 girls, and my mom would be like, "What do you want for dinner?" And I'd be like... No, I was fucking speechless. I was just like, yo... And so when I got to Rutgers, you know, and I went to the school which had like a real women's college with a ton of feminism, when that stuff started, my life, I began to think, oh, that's it.
Yeah.
Because literally my poor sisters and, yeah, I mean, when I think of how I did with girls, I often think not just of the ideas of who you sleep with or who you date, I also think of the ideas of how difficult and how long it took for me and my sister's relationships to get normal when you have that asymmetrical kind of childhood where, you know, I could have at least sided with them once. Yeah. I could have been like, no, for real, I could have been like, yo, this is messed up. But like most people when you're young, even when you're old, you kind of pursue your privilege. And that stood between us for many years because, I mean, I think about my sisters. My sisters are great, man. They're like awesome people. Were always loyal to me. And for most of my youth, I was never loyal to them. I never did anything to increase their freedom or happiness. And I think that also speaks to that kind of privilege. And it speaks also to what, if one really wants to have like healthy relationships with your siblings or even with the people around you that you at least should consider begin wrestling with, which is something I didn't want to do. The last thing I wanted to do was confront that kind of stuff. But I realized if I didn't do it, my sister and me would never be close the way I dreamed, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's time for your questions, if I'm not mistaken, right? So I believe there are people who are circulating. Junot Díaz. Long glasses. Am I correct? There are people circulating with microphones. Is that right? So raise your hand and they'll find you.
Thank you, bro. Appreciate it.
How are you, Junot, man? My name's Junot Díaz.
That's my man right there.
I'm from across the way, Cuba.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I definitely related a lot to what you were just talking about, masculine privilege. Being able to come home with, if there was a Playboy magazine, nobody was really upset. If you had a sister and she even wiggled the wrong way, there was a problem. So I could definitely relate to that, and how that sort of transcends into your relationships as an adult male in the future, how you view women, and how some of the issues that it can cause that you later have to talk to a therapist about when it comes to, in terms of intimacy and how you look at things. And then I also wanted to ask you a question in terms of like how you feel, because I have African descent as well, and I came from a biracial Cuban family where my mother was a white Cuban and my father was a black Cuban, and that was a big problem in my household. How you feel in terms of like the racism within our own community, because I know a lot's going on right now with the Dominican Republic, revoking citizenship from a lot of individuals who came over from Haiti illegally.
And people who were born in the Dominican Republic.
Yeah, so it's do you find yourself sort of like having to explain that or wrestle with that with people sometimes,
Ooh, yeah.
On a regular basis?
Yeah, I mean, who doesn't have to wrestle with trying to make the operations of racism clear? All of our societies, whether you're in the Dominican Republic or the United States, it's sort of like hanging around with Holocaust deniers all day.
Yeah.
When it comes to the question of race. You bring up race and suddenly it's like you're at the convention of Holocaust deniers. Because everyone is like, any chance they get to disqualify race as operational, they will. Like people will literally be like, oh, slavery? That was class, not race.
Yeah.
And whether it's the Dominican Republic or New Jersey, you find a lot of the same codes. My thing is, and certainly college helped me a lot in this ways, is that what I have discovered is what we call race and racism. The technical term for this is white supremacy, but that there's a reason why in academia they have no problem using it, but it doesn't appear in newspapers. Yeah? They use this other inaccurate code, racism or race, right? When it's really white supremacy. What we've discovered, and what you don't have to be sort of in ethnic studies to know, is that white supremacy doesn't reinvent itself, which is to say that the Dominican Republic suffers from the same exact white the United States suffers from. Yeah? Just because it's people of color doesn't mean that they don't have the same ideas and thinkings that we would think of the most malign form of white supremacy. Said another way, is that, guys, y'all don't need white people for this to be a profoundly racist society. If you took every white person and sent them to Middle Earth for a year, they could come back and the shit would be exactly the same, except the lightest members of us would be like, ah. And because this stuff can't exist. It cannot exist if it's not inside of all of us. So whether I'm sitting in front of my family, sitting around my Dominican family, and they want to be a bunch of lunatics around race, or am I at my Rutgers sophomore class, I still remember this, 20-something years, at my Rutgers sophomore class, and I'm looking at students telling me that there's no such thing as racism. I think that the malign effects of white supremacy, I think the toxic structures which were created to preserve the privileges of the constituents who most benefit from white supremacy, we still have to confront in all of our societies and all of our families the way that white supremacy lives inside of all of us. Guys, look, we're not talking about white folks. White supremacy is a system that connects to everyone. When I sit with my students and I bring in a video and show them all the ball players' wives. Y'all want to see some crazy race shit? Is look at every person of African descent playing sports and line up their wives. And be like, is there a system here? And so I just think that systems have to be confronted, and we're still far from this. But to pretend that one group or another is somehow excused is absurd. You know, and I think that what you're pointing to is how much the work we have to do inside of our own communities, even while we're being afflicted by other communities from outside. Yeah. I mean, I always think like I couldn't decide which was worse, the racism inside my family or the racism in New Jersey. I felt like they just shook hands every morning.
Because you get situations where, you know, like you were saying earlier about like what group of males is like supposedly like privileged. And I know growing up, like Cuban girls were told, you know, you want to marry marry a white man or marry an American man. You want to stay away from us, you know, but you marry whiter, the kid comes out with better hair, el pelo mejor, el pelo bueno.
No, Hitler would be very pleased with, hey, chill the hell out. Hitler would be very pleased with people of color's dating habits. For real. Look, I teach at MIT. Yeah, I teach at MIT, and I have students who literally will take a photograph of every single Asian woman with a white boyfriend. Now, all of us fall in love for individual reasons, but to pretend that they're not patterns is absurd. And to pretend that we don't have a sexual economy that is inflected by race is absurd. That is absurd to the point where it makes me think you're all smoking crack. You know? So, whatever. We can smoke away later, but...
You got another question?
Junot, can you expound a little bit about the issue of white supremacy and intellectual identity, especially in boys of color, and the impact that it has, and how you've narrated that as a single thread through a lot of your novels, particularly Drown, because it's a huge issue that we, as urban educators, are dealing with in trying to extricate the issue of our skin color and our identity from our intellectual identity as well.
Well, I mean, I think in general, look, especially if you're working at a high school, middle school, it sounds like, you know, you're in the front lines with that. All of us who work with young men know that something is happening. Something is happening. And part of that something that is happening has been long in the making. Yeah, which shifts and crises in what we call masculine identity, which shifts and crises in what we would call the kind of work that's available that's being masculinized versus feminized. Yeah, a lot is going on. And our kids, look, we also have a popular culture which acts as a megaphone for the larger American tendencies towards anti-intellectualism. This is a country that has among its many streams a very virulent form of anti-intellectualism. This is a country where a president from an Ivy League college, yeah, whose father is from an Ivy League college, goes out of his way to be an aw shucks one of us. The anti-intellectualism, if America in general has anti-intellectual at a code level, the poorest members of our community, the most vulnerable, usually take this stuff and amplify it times 20. Yeah? And so I think that our anti-intellectualism plays out in our urban schools in really nightmarish ways. It's so hard for us to convince our kids that, you know, being intellectual is a normative part, especially for boys, can be a normative part of masculine identity. When the whole country is trying to sell them a very simplistic form of masculine identity. I think that a lot of the work that people are doing at the schools is so damn important, but it's hand-to-hand combat. Our educators are saving boys one by one because there's neither the political will nor the capital nor the structural push to really confront what's at stake in our youth. I mean, as a country, we've basically abandoned public education across the board. This is a country that absolutely thinks it's, no. This is a country that absolutely thinks that supporting public education is somehow an evil communist plot, who thinks that corporations' cannibalistic impulse to extract privilege, that they should be in charge of public education, who thinks that there's nothing wrong. Guys, forget it. Save your clapping for your fucked up politicians, you know? who think the university as a nexus for profit extraction. This is the world we live in. And so you wonder why our poor people, our poor teachers are having to save people hand by hand. Because the society has almost completely abdicated its civic responsibility for creating an educated future. And I just wonder who the hell benefits from that, you know? And look, for me, if the poorest kids and the poorest boys aren't getting education, you guys know what? That's our future. That's our absolute future. You know, and I just, again, as someone who came up through this, for me, the amount of years it took me to be able to even reveal that I was a reader. And I went to college. I was in college where it was safe. I bet you if I go out to this university right here and hang out with the Black and Latino kids and probably other kids, how many of them are actually in college pretending they thugs? No, for real. How many Black and Latino kids are like actually in college and trying to convince everybody that they tough, that they're like, I'm fuck that dude up. Even in our own schools, in our own elite places of education, boys find it hard to put down that iron mask of simplified masculinity. And you wonder why our kids in high school won't do it. I mean, this is just a description of what's wrong. And the only thing that we can do is do what y'all doing, which is that hand-to-hand combat, and hope one day the society decides that our future might be more interesting if our kids are educated.
I think we got time for one more question, which will take us a little
Let's get a young woman here. Do we got somebody?
Oh, we got somebody down here, right? Hold on.
Hi. There's two of us.
Ask both questions. Go ahead. If you don't make them comments, you can ask both of them fast.
Well, I'm going to switch tracks a little bit here and get a little more anecdotal possibly, but I was wondering what was the best piece of advice you ever got as a writer, and what would be a really good piece of advice you'd like to give to someone who really wants to write about the world and like the modern project of being?
I mean, I don't mean to like sound a little dyspeptic about the question. I apologize. No, I apologize straight off the bat. Look, you must understand that if you're a person who wants to be an artist right now, if you want to be a writer right now, the ways that we have professionalized art. In other words, what advice can I give a young artist that's not already online? Because they have professionalized art so much. I mean, nothing has really changed, right, to be an artist, except our society has convinced young artists that being an artist is a career. That being a young artist is like, I should leave college and pursue arts the way I pursue being a doctor. And I'm not saying this is what you're thinking about at all. I'm just saying that any answer I give you is coming in the context of how arts has even been instrumentalized. For me, I always ask young people or anyone is, why would anybody want to read your shit? Wait. You guys misunderstand the question. What I mean is that when I ask myself, why does anybody want to read anything I write? I simply say, well, because I am bringing news of the world. How, as an artist, do you get news of the world? You get news of the world by living in the world, not by pursuing arts at an instrumental, professionalized level. You can write a book and have a great career as a writer by pursuing it careeristically. You can. I don't think your art will be worth anything, but I'm convinced you could write 9, 10, 11, 12 books, sell them, win some awards. I think the reason that art has survived the way it survives is because its practitioners communicate to us news of the world. And if I had any advice to give a young artist, is that why would any young artist be worried about whatever their practice is? Like if you wanted to be a writer, I would be like, don't write for 3 years. Spend those 3 years living out in the world and getting torn up and tearing it up, because there's nothing about our craft that needs to be pursued with such, Talmudic concentration. But what does need to be pursued in our culture, which does everything to discourage us, is a passionate engagement with the world. And I think that if I had to give you any advice in a world of advice, I would say the you who spends most of her life living versus not writing will be the you that writes the books I want to read. So, that other question, and we're done. There was some other person.
Well, I think we should. Go ahead.
Hi. Oh, wow. Okay. Over here.
I know.
Yeah, oh, sorry. I thought you were looking for me. Okay.
Y'all really think we can see you? Y'all are cute. No, please, your question.
At the beginning of your talk, you sort of talked about the marginalization of immigrant narratives as like not being taken seriously within the academic study of American literature. So I was just curious more what your thoughts were on how sort of the academic community and the literary community specifically can go about changing that culture beyond sort of like the token inclusion of a few minority texts on every syllabus.
Thank you. And what was your question? I think the first question about, again, I was discussing the ideas of immigrant literature at a larger context, so beyond academia. But just to address academia, the thing is that we have so many young faculty and young grad students who are doing that work. The problem is that they tend not to be the ones being given tenure, and they tend not to be the ones in charge. There's a part of me that thinks, like, again, if we outwait these old folks long enough, perhaps things will change. I don't know if I have a real answer to you, because institutionally, my area, it's kind of weak. I just think a lot of that work is being done by young people, and I think that, and not just young faculty, but other faculty who have held tough in this. And the country is changing. This is not the country we pretend it is. This is a country that turns on the TV every day and goes to the movies every day and listens to the radio every day and receives a delusion about itself. It receives a delusion. It's like, turn on TV, everybody's white. Go to the movies, everybody's a white guy with homoerotic issues. This country's far more diverse and far more profoundly human than that. And I think eventually our reading habits and our cultural systems will catch up, or we'll make them catch up. And I think the final point about this is that we must understand that literacy is very much a part of the other issue that we were talking about, is that how do we get anyone to read in a culture where there is no space for contemplation? If full-grown adults can't muster the time to sit still for 2 hours, how are the greatest market sectors of these corporations going to be able to resist the urge to check their Twitter every 5 minutes, to scroll down Tumblr all day long? The thing is that there are trillions of dollars trying to capture young people's imaginary and move them away from any contemplative life, from any life of deliberation, from any human rhythm. And books, novels, poetry, essay, sculpture, dance, This is from a much more human rhythm. And it's a literacy that you have to fight to preserve, because the whole country is trying to disrupt that literacy. The whole culture is trying to say that there is no time, that you're living in a sped-up world. So just even beyond the fact that one comes from a Latino background, we're already at a baseline that doesn't encourage people to sit still and read, to just take time and deliberate and to contemplate. And I think that we need time to deliberate and contemplate to feel human. I don't think you can reconstruct and reconstitute yourself after every day without that time. And part of the reason most of our souls feel so heavy and so frantic is because we don't get the deliberation and the contemplation that would allow us to reconstitute ourselves after a day of living in a society that only encourages you to compete, create hierarchies, and accumulate. And then the larger question is, well, then what about the folks who fall outside of the cultural privileges and who fall outside of the mainstream? It's really tough, man. I know I wouldn't have a career. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for urban educators, urban readers, and sort of fiction nerds. How has the urban community, how has the Latino community responded to me? Very complex ways. Yeah? Because a large part of folks don't read, period. And in my community, people were like, I'm not going to read you ever. But the other side of that coin is that in every community, there is always a cadre of people who champion reading in really motivating ways. And those are the people who kept my career alive. I mean, I think that if it wasn't for librarians, if it wasn't for high school teachers teaching my first book, if it wasn't for nerdy readers who would follow wherever I was published and talk to each other, I wouldn't have a career. But I would argue that these frontline troops are the ones who are preserving reading across the board. Booksellers, libraries, and reading geeks. And to them, to those sort of like, again, to those guardians of this most sacred practice of what keeps us human, we owe a lot to them. And I am not completely disheartened by how many people don't read, because I always think, given the forces aligned against us, reading has survived far better than I think they expected. Anyway, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Junot Díaz.